The world's most advanced chips are concentrated on an island that also blocks China's easiest route into the Pacific. That is the Taiwan problem. One island sits at the center of two different systems. One powers the digital economy, the other shapes the military map of East Asia. Taiwan is not just a semiconductor hub. It is a strategic node where industry and geography collapse into one problem. And if that node breaks, the shock does not stay in the Taiwan Strait. It moves through factories, fleets, alliances, markets, and the wider Pacific all at once. Taiwan matters first because it helps the world compute, not in a vague sense, in a very literal one. The devices, servers, cloud systems, AI infrastructure, and advanced electronics that define the modern economy all depend on chips. But the most important detail is not that chips matter. It is that the most advanced chip-making capacity remains unusually concentrated in one place, Taiwan. That concentration did not happen by accident. It came from decades of accumulated skill, manufacturing discipline, supplier density, engineering culture, and capital intensity. At the highest end of chip production, scale is not enough. Money is not enough. Time is not enough. The ecosystem has to exist, and Taiwan built one of the most important ecosystems on Earth. Taiwan is not just where the world's chips are made. It is also the island that helps decide who controls access to the Pacific. That is what makes Taiwan different from a normal export power. Most industrial hubs do not also sit inside one of the most dangerous strategic positions in the region. Taiwan does both at once. This is why simple diversification headlines can be misleading. Yes, new fabs are being built outside Taiwan. Yes, more governments now talk about resilience, friend-shoring, and supply chain security. But that does not mean the problem has been solved, because the most advanced manufacturing capability is harder to replicate than press releases suggest. The buildings can be copied faster than the ecosystem. The machinery can be purchased faster than the production culture. And the real bottleneck is not just hardware, it is accumulated precision. Most people say Taiwan matters because of semiconductors. Beijing's strategists care just as much about what Taiwan does to the map. That is the first correction. Chips explain only half the story. Taiwan is also a piece of geography that shapes naval access, air routes, and the balance of power in the Western Pacific. So Taiwan is not merely important because it exports something valuable. It matters because the world built a critical layer of modern computing on top of a small number of clean rooms sitting on one exposed island. That is industrial concentration, but industrial concentration is only the first half of the story. Even if Taiwan made no advanced semiconductors at all, it would still matter strategically. Because Taiwan sits at the pivotal point of the first island chain, between Japan to the north and the Philippines to the south, Taiwan helps shape the line that separates China's near seas from the wider Pacific. That matters because military power does not move across flat maps. It moves through airspace, sea lanes, choke points, and access corridors. Taiwan sits in the middle of that geometry, not beside it, inside it. Taiwan is the middle lock in the first island chain. If that lock breaks, the whole Western Pacific geometry changes. That is why Taiwan is larger than a local dispute. Its role is structural. It affects whether the chain stays coherent or becomes more porous in the middle. For Beijing, Taiwan is not only a sovereignty question, it is also a sea power question. Control of Taiwan would change China's maritime position. It would make it easier to project power eastward. It would alter surveillance, air operations, naval movement, and pressure on the wider chain. It would not erase every constraint, but it would loosen one of the most important ones. New fabs in America and Japan matter, but the most advanced chip making is still heavily concentrated in Taiwan. That is the uncomfortable point. Diversification is real, but the deepest concentration still sits on the island. The system has widened slightly, but the center of gravity has not moved very far. This is why Taiwan planning is never just about Taiwan itself. It extends to Japanese airfields, to the waters near Okinawa, to the northern Philippines, to the wider logic of access and denial across the Western Pacific. Taiwan is the middle lock because it affects the chain around it, and once geography and industry are placed on the same island, the two stories stop being separate. They become one system. At this point, the shape of the problem becomes clearer. Taiwan is not only a manufacturing concentration, and it is not only a strategic hinge, it is both at once. That overlap is what turns Taiwan from a regional dispute into a systems-level fault line. A crisis over Taiwan would not be only a military event, and it would not be only a supply chain event. It would strike both systems at the same time. If tensions rose sharply, planners would not only worry about fleets and airfields, they would also worry about computing capacity, advanced chip supply, data infrastructure, and downstream manufacturing. Phones would matter, servers would matter, cloud infrastructure would matter, but so would sensors, precision weapons, communications systems, and modern defense procurement. Taiwan's chip dominance may help deter conflict, but it also makes the island one of the most dangerous single points of failure in the world economy. That is the paradox. The more indispensable Taiwan becomes, the more everyone has reason to avoid disruption. But the same dependence also raises the stakes of coercion, crisis planning, and worst-case scenarios. This is why strategists talk about fabs and airfields in the same breath, because the island is both a production node and a military position, because the same place that makes leading-edge chips also sits inside one of the key access problems in the Pacific. Because a shock there would not stay within one domain. If China controlled Taiwan, it would not just gain territory, it would push its sea power deeper into the Pacific. That is why Taiwan is not only about nationalism or politics, it changes military geometry. If you value calm, in-depth explanations like this, subscribe to Beneath Systems for more videos that uncover the systems shaping our world. Control of the island would alter the position from which China sees, reaches, and pressures the wider region, and that is what makes Taiwan so difficult to think about cleanly. The world usually likes separate categories: economic issue, military issue, diplomatic issue. Taiwan resists that. It sits where those categories collapse into each other. One island, two concentrations, one combined risk. This overlap produced one of the most important ideas in modern geopolitics: the silicon shield. The theory is simple. If Taiwan is so central to advanced chip production, then conflict over Taiwan becomes too costly for everyone. Too costly for supply chains, too costly for markets, too costly for technology firms, too costly for governments that depend on advanced semiconductors. In that sense, Taiwan's industrial importance might help deter war. There is some logic in that, but only up to a point, because fabs are not abstract symbols. They are fragile physical systems. They need water, power, chemical inputs, stable logistics, highly trained labor, constant precision. A major conflict would not leave them untouched, which means the silicon shield is not a hard shield. It is a cost multiplier. It raises the price of crisis. It does not remove the possibility of crisis. Trade between Taiwan and China became deeper, but military pressure rose with it. Interdependence did not remove the crisis. It changed the stakes. That is one of the most important corrections in this story. Economic entanglement can create caution, but it can also create leverage, exposure, and higher pressure on both sides. Dependence is not the same thing as stability, and this is where the shield starts to look less like protection and more like vulnerability. If one island carries too much industrial weight, then every threat to that island becomes globally amplified, not only because the island matters, but because the concentration is so extreme. A Taiwan chip disruption would not only hit phones and servers, it would also hit weapons, sensors, and military procurement. That is the hidden connection. Advanced semiconductors are not only part of consumer electronics, they also feed the systems modern militaries rely on. A chip shock can become a defense shock very quickly, so the silicon shield is real only in a limited sense. It increases the cost of conflict, it does not dissolve the strategic struggle, and if anything, it makes Taiwan more central to every serious contingency. That is why the next question is not whether Taiwan matters, it is who needs it and why. Taiwan sits at the center of several different strategic logics, and each major actor reads the island through a different lens. For Taiwan, the challenge is survival, political autonomy, economic resilience, military deterrence, international relevance. It has to remain indispensable without becoming only a hostage to its own importance. For Beijing, Taiwan is sovereignty, legitimacy, and strategic position at the same time. It is not viewed only as unfinished politics, it is also viewed as a geographic problem that limits China's maritime freedom. For Washington, Taiwan is more than a semiconductor supplier. It is part of the regional deterrence architecture. A change in Taiwan's status would affect both industrial resilience and the geometry of power in East Asia. And for Japan, Taiwan is not a distant side issue. It connects directly to Southwest Island defense, nearby sea lanes, and the coherence of the first island chain. That is why Japanese concern is structural, not symbolic. symbolic. Taiwan sits too close to Japan's own security environment to be treated as someone else's problem. This is what makes compromise structurally hard. Each actor is looking at the same island, but not at the same problem. Taiwan sees survival. China sees sovereignty and breakout. The United States sees deterrence and industrial dependence. Japan sees regional geometry and direct exposure. Those perspectives overlap just enough to create friction and differ just enough to block easy settlement. That is why Taiwan remains politically ambiguous but materially central. Formal recognition only tells part of the story. Systemic relevance tells the rest. If Taiwan's status changed by force, the consequences would not stop at the shoreline. They would radiate outward across multiple systems at once. The first shock would be industrial. Advanced chip supply would be disrupted. Technology firms would face immediate stress. Production timelines would shift. Investment plans would freeze. Pricing across key parts of the digital economy would move. The second shock would be military. The first island chain would become harder to hold together in its current form. Regional access calculations would change. Naval posture would shift. Air defense planning would tighten. Alliance credibility would come under pressure. The third shock would be commercial and financial. Shipping risk would rise. Insurance behavior would change. Markets would reprice regional exposure. Governments would move from abstract concern to crisis management. Taiwan matters because its factories and its geography operate as one system. Changing the island's status would hit both the tech stack and the military balance at once. That is the deeper meaning of Taiwan. It is not only a disputed territory and not only a semiconductor center, it is the place where industrial dependence and strategic geography have been concentrated on the same piece of ground. This is why the question, does Taiwan matter more because of chips or because of geography, is the wrong question. It matters because both are stacked together. If either one existed alone, Taiwan would still matter. Together, they make it uniquely dangerous and uniquely important. Taiwan is not just a semiconductor hub, it is a strategic node where industry and geography collapse into one problem. That is why a Taiwan crisis would not remain local. It would not remain military. It would not remain industrial. It would move through all of them at once. The real risk is not only that Taiwan could fall silent as a factory or change hands as territory. It is that one island now sits at the point where the global computing stack and the military balance of the Pacific depend on the same piece of ground. That is why Taiwan matters, not only for what it makes, but for where it sits. If this video gave you a clearer way to understand the world beneath the surface, subscribe to Beneath Systems for more deep dives every week.